The sound of the warning sirens clawed through the air like an animal in pain. Bright red lights flashed in chaotic patterns across the hallways of the rehabilitation center, bathing everything in a stuttering crimson glow. Dr. Mira Hoàng stood in her cramped lab, frozen for a split second as her mind raced to catch up with the chaos unraveling around her. The intercom blared with the panicked voice of the AI, "Attention, Class X entity detected. Evacuation is mandatory. This is not a drill." Mira ignored it. Her eyes were locked on the holographic display in front of her, where crash trajectory data painted a grim picture. Whatever had just entered the atmosphere had the mass of a small ship but the biological signature of something alive. Very alive. And dangerous. The diagnostic scanners to keep up as more data streamed in. Neural interface ports, titanium composite bones, energy signatures of a quantum core running hotter than it should. Then it hit her, the pattern recognition system tagged the entity with a name. Umbra Nexus. Mira's breath caught in her throat. She'd read the reports. Everyone in the galaxy had. The Umbra Nexus wasn't just a Vexter, it was the Vexter, a legend wrapped in fear. She swallowed hard and looked out the reinforced glass of her lab. Through the thick canopy of alien trees, smoke was rising in the distance. The crash site wasn't far, maybe half a kilometer at most. Behind her, the lab door hissed open. Heavy boots stomped in, and Mira didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You're not seriously thinking of going out there," Cade Theron said, his voice sharp. Mira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she grabbed her medical kit, the large one, the one reserved for the worst cases. She slung it over her shoulder, her hands moving on autopilot as she stuffed additional supplies into her satchel: stabilizers, nerve blockers, a field repair tool. "You are serious," Cade growled, stepping into her line of sight. His square jaw was set in a look of disbelief. "Mira, that's not just another injured animal out there. You know what that thing has done, what it's capable of." "I do," she said quietly, zipping the satchel shut. She turned to face him, her dark eyes steady despite the storm of sirens and lights. "And that's why I'm going. If it's hurt, if it's unstable, it's even more dangerous. You know that. And you think you can just, what, fix it? Talk it out of murdering us all?" His voice rose with incredulity. "You're insane. I'm calling in reinforcements. We should be putting as much distance as possible between us and that thing." "No." Mira's voice was calm but firm, like tempered steel. "Reinforcements will just escalate this. If it reacts the way it's programmed to react, we're all in danger. The only chance we have is to de-escalate before it gets to that point." Cade stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You're betting." "I'm not betting, Cade." Mira moved past him, the edge of her satchel brushing his arm as she headed for the door. "I'm doing my job." He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not cruel. "You don't have to do this." She looked up at him for a moment, but she straightened her shoulders, shook her head, and gave him the faintest smile. "If I don't, who will?" Before he could argue further, the ground beneath them rumbled, the tremor rolling through the facility like a distant earthquake. Mira's heart skipped a beat. It had landed. Cade let her go, cursing under his breath. "You're going to get yourself hurt. Then make sure I don't," she said simply before stepping into the hallway. The trek to the crash site was surreal. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual hum of alien insects and rustling leaves muted as if the world itself was terrified of what had arrived. Smoke thickened the air, stinging her eyes and clogging her lungs, but Mira pressed on, her steps steady despite the weight of her gear. When she reached the edge of the crater, her breath caught again. It was massive. A deep, jagged scar was carved into the earth, with fragments of metal and glowing debris scattered like shattered glass. At the center lay Umbra Nexus. The beast was magnificent. 13 meters of sleek black plating, its surface shimmering faintly with an iridescent glow. Organic muscle and synthetic machinery merged seamlessly, its body a terrifying marriage of biology and technology. Sparks flickered from torn cables along its spine, and a low hum of energy pulsed irregularly from its damaged core. It wasn't moving, not yet, but its eyes, those glowing crimson orbs, flickered weakly, scanning its surroundings, and then they locked on Mira. She froze. Her medical scanner trembled in her hand as the beast's gaze bore into her. She could feel the weight of its intelligence, its awareness. It was calculating her, judging her, deciding if she was a threat. Her mouth was dry, but she forced herself to speak, her voice soft, steady. "I'm here to help you." The Nexus let out a low growl, a sound that rumbled through the ground and into her bones, but it didn't attack. Not yet. Mira took a cautious step forward, her hands visible, her medical kit slung across her shoulder like a peace offering. You're hurt, she said. I can fix that, but you have to let me. Another growl, louder this time. The red glow of its eyes intensified, but its massive body remained still, its energy reserves clearly depleted. In the back of her mind, Mira could hear Cade's voice screaming at her to run, to turn back, but she silenced the thought, focusing on the creature in front of her. She knelt at the edge of the crater, setting down her kit and opening it slowly. I'm not your enemy, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know you've only ever been treated like a weapon, but that's not all you are. You're more than that. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, to her astonishment, the Nexus shifted slightly, lowering its head just enough for her to see the scorched plating and the exposed circuits beneath. It was hurt, and for reasons she couldn't yet understand, it was letting her help. The hum of the creature's core pulsed faintly in the air, a rhythm that seemed to sync with Mira's racing heart. She crouched at the edge of the crater, hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Every instinct screamed at her to back away, to retreat to the safety of the facility, but she ignored it. The creature was watching her, its glowing red eyes narrowed as if it were trying to piece together why this tiny human hadn't already run. Mira reached into her medical kit, moving slowly, deliberately, so as not to provoke it. She pulled out a stabilizer, its cylindrical surface catching the faint glow of the fires around them. She held it up, her voice calm and measured. This will stop the overheating in your core. The Nexus's head tilted slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't trust, no, not yet, but it was hesitation, and hesitation was enough. Mira took it as permission and slid down the edge of the crater. Dirt crumbled beneath her boots, but she kept her focus on the creature, her breathing slow and controlled. When she reached the base of the impact site, the sheer size of it hit her anew. Up close, the Nexus was a monolith of power, its armor a shifting mosaic of organic and synthetic perfection. But now, she could see the cracks, the places where the seams had split and the soft glow of circuitry peeked through. It was vulnerable. Mira knelt beside its shoulder, careful not to touch it just yet. I need to open this panel to cool the system, she said softly. Her fingers hovered over the jagged edges of its armor, and she waited, watching the creature for any sign of protest. The Nexus didn't move, though its eyes followed her every gesture, unblinking, predatory. As her tools clicked against the panel, Cade's voice crackled to life in her earpiece. Mira, do you even know what you're doing down there? His tone was sharp, edged with panic. She could hear the distant wail of alarms from the facility behind him. Fixing it, she replied curtly, her hands never pausing. A faint hiss escaped as she released the panel, revealing a tangled mess of scorched wires and overheating conduits. The heat hit her like a wave, but she didn't flinch. Mira, listen to me, this thing isn't just broken, it's dangerous. You're playing with a weapon that doesn't have a safety. Get out of there now. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. Cade, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. Let me do my job. You're betting on a hunch. No, she murmured, adjusting the stabilizer and locking it into place. I'm betting its life on hope. There was silence on the other end, save for the faint static of the comms. Cade was still there, but he didn't have an answer for that. The stabilizer hummed to life, and the Nexus let out a deep, guttural growl, its body tensing beneath her touch. Mira's pulse quickened, but she didn't pull back. Instead, she spoke softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a thread of light. I know it hurts, but it'll help, I promise. For a moment, the Nexus didn't move, then its muscles relaxed, just slightly, enough for her to continue. She adjusted the device, the heat fading as the core's temperature began to stabilize. The growl subsided, replaced by a low, almost questioning rumble. Mira allowed herself a small smile. See, not so bad. The Nexus shifted, its massive head turning just enough to bring her into full view. For the first time, the red glow in its eyes seemed curious. It studied her, and she felt the weight of its gaze like a tangible force. It wasn't just watching her, it was assessing her, trying to understand her. The moment was interrupted by a sudden crackle of static in her comms. Cade's voice came through, sharp and urgent. Mira, you need to get out of there. Now. What is it? She asked, frowning. Reinforcements, he spat. Some idiot in command decided to call in a strike team. They're sending gunships. Mira, they'll be there in minutes. Her stomach sank. They can't. If they engage, it'll go into defensive mode. Do you know what that means? Yeah, Cade said grimly. It means it wipes us all out. Mira turned back to the Nexus, her mind racing. She could see the flicker of understanding in its eyes, as if it, too, knew what was coming. It shifted slightly, its body tensing, preparing for a fight. The faint hum of its energy core began to rise again, and Mira realized with a jolt of fear that if it recharged enough to reactivate its full combat protocols, there would be no stopping it. No, she whispered, stepping closer to its head. You don't have to do this. I can keep you safe. Let me help. The Nexus growled low in its throat, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. It wasn't anger, it was warning. But Mira didn't back down. She knelt in front of it, her eyes level with its glowing gaze. I know they've only ever treated you like a weapon, she said, her voice trembling with urgency. But you're more than that. I see it. You're more than what they made you to be, and I will protect you, but you have to trust me. The creature stared at her, unblinking, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, impossibly, it lowered its head, the faintest gesture of surrender. Mira's chest tightened with a mix of relief and awe, but the moment was short-lived. The distant roar of engines cut through the air, growing louder by the second. She turned toward the horizon and saw them, 3 gunships streaking toward the crater, their weapons glowing ominously. Cade, she said into her calm, her voice steadier than she felt. I need you to do something for me. Mira, don't. Shut down their systems, all of them. I don't care how you do it, just give me time. There was a pause, and then Cade's resigned sigh crackled through the earpiece. You're going to owe me for this. The engines grew louder, the gunships closing in. Mira turned back to the Nexus, placing a hand gently on its massive head. Stay with me, she whispered. The shot tore through the air, a beam of searing light that illuminated the crater in blinding intensity. Mira barely had time to react before Umbra Nexus surged forward, its massive form moving with a speed that defied its size. The beam struck the ground behind them, sending up a plume of molten rock and smoke. Mira stumbled, her heart hammering as the creature placed itself between her and the gunships, its armor gleaming menacingly in the chaos. No, Mira shouted, her voice cracking against the roar of the engines. She scrambled to her feet, waving her arms frantically. Don't engage, stand down. Umbra Nexus growled low and deep, a sound that rippled through the air like an earthquake. Its core was pulsing again, faster this time, and Mira could feel the heat radiating off its body. She knew what was coming, the energy spike, the surge that would activate its full combat systems. If that happened, there would be no stopping it. The gunships wouldn't stand a chance, but neither would the facility, the forest, or anyone within a 100-mile radius. In the sky, the gunships circled like vultures, their cannons glowing with charged plasma. The pilot's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. This is Commander Vraxis of the Coalition Strike Team. Stand down, human. We have the authority to neutralize the threat. Mira clenched her fists, her mind racing. She turned to Umbra Nexus, its massive frame crouched low, muscles coiled like a spring. Listen to me, she yelled, her voice breaking through the tension. You don't have to fight them. They don't understand, but I do. Please, trust me. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its glowing red eyes flickered, shifting between her and the approaching ships. Mira felt the weight of the decision hanging in the air, as though the universe itself had paused to see what would happen next. And then a second shot was fired. Umbra Nexus roared, the sound deafening, primal. It leaped into motion, its body a blur of black and silver as it dodged the beam with impossible agility. The ground shook beneath Mira as the creature sprang into the air, its claws as it lunged at the nearest gunship. Sparks erupted as its titanium-reinforced talons raked across the ship's hull, sending it spinning out of control. No, 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 Mira shouted, her hands trembling as she grabbed her comb. Cade, I need those targeting systems offline now. Working on it. Cade's voice was strained, punctuated by the sound of frantic typing. Their encryption's tighter than I expected. Give me another 60 seconds. We don't have 60 seconds, Mira screamed, watching as Umbra Nexus turned its sights on the second gunship. The creature's quantum core was glowing brighter now, its energy readings spiking dangerously high. It was operating on instinct, programmed to eliminate threats, but Mira could see the strain in its movements. The stabilizer she'd installed wasn't enough to handle this level of exertion. She did the only thing she could think of, Grabbing a portable diagnostic pad from her kit, she sprinted into the battlefield, the heat of the gunship engines scorching her skin as she ran. "Umbra!" she yelled, her voice raw with desperation. "Stop!" The creature landed in front of her, its massive frame looming over her like a living storm. It growled, its breath hot and metallic, but it didn't attack. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, filled with a fury that bordered on desperation. For the first time, she saw something more than rage in its expression: pain, confusion, a fractured sense of purpose. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're not just a weapon. You're not what they made you to be. You can choose." Umbra Nexus hesitated, its massive chest heaving as it stared at her. Behind them, the third gunship lined up. Mira saw it out of the corner of her eye, felt the heat building, and knew she had seconds to act. She stepped closer to the creature, her voice soft but urgent. "Trust me, please." The plasma cannon fired, and everything seemed to slow. Mira felt the heat against her back and saw the faint glow of the beam in her peripheral vision. But before it could strike, Umbra Nexus moved. Its massive body shielded her completely, the beam slamming into its armor with a deafening crack. The impact sent it skidding backward, its claws carving deep trenches into the earth. Mira gasped, her hands flying to the creature's side. The panel she'd repaired earlier had been blown open, sparks flying as exposed circuitry burned. The smell of scorched metal filled the air, but Umbra Nexus didn't collapse. It stayed upright, its legs trembling under the strain, and let out a guttural snarl that seemed to shake the very ground. "Mira," Cade's voice crackled through the calm. "I've got their systems." The gunships faltered, and their targeting systems scrambled. Mira barely registered the reprieve as she focused on the creature in front of her. Its energy core was fluctuating wildly, the pulsing light dimming and flaring erratically. It was falling apart. "You did it," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for her tools. "You protected me." Umbra Nexus tilted its head, its glowing eyes dimming slightly as it watched her. There was something almost resigned in its gaze, as though it understood the cost of what it had done. Mira felt a lump rise in her throat. She'd asked it to trust her, and it had, at the expense of its own survival. "Not yet," she said, her voice cracking. "You're not done yet." With practiced precision, she reconnected the stabilizer, her hands moving faster than they ever had before. Sparks danced across her fingers as she realigned the damaged circuits. Ignoring the heat that burned her palms, the creature rumbled low in its throat, a sound that sent tears streaming down her face. "I'm not giving up on you," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "You don't get to give up either." Finally, the core's pulsing began to stabilize. The light in its chest grew steady, the chaotic fluctuations easing into a calm, rhythmic glow. Umbra Nexus let out a deep, shuddering breath, its massive frame relaxing slightly as the tension ebbed away. Mira collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as she let out a shaky laugh. She placed a hand on the creature's side, her fingers brushing against its armor. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the core. The Nexus tilted its head, watching her with something that almost looked like curiosity, and for the first time, Mira thought she saw the faintest hint of understanding in its eyes. The moment of calm didn't last. As Mira knelt beside the towering form of Umbra Nexus, her hands still pressed against its battered armor, a sharp, shrill sound cut through the smoky air. She whipped her head around to see the lead gunship rebooting, its systems flickering back online despite Cade's earlier hack. Somewhere in the distance, the AI's voice from the facility crackled through her calm. "Warning, secondary strike protocols were initiated. Incoming." Mira didn't need the rest of the sentence. Her eyes widened as she saw the gunship's missile launcher begin to swivel, its targeting systems scrambling to lock onto anything that moved. The soldiers on board must have switched to manual controls, bypassing the disabled targeting systems. "No," Mira whispered, her voice breaking. She turned to Umbra Nexus, her heart pounding against her ribs. "They're coming back. You can't fight them again. You're too weak." Umbra Nexus tilted its head, the dim red glow of its eyes flickering. It rumbled low in its throat, a sound that resonated like distant thunder, and Mira knew it wasn't backing down. It was preparing for one last stand. "Don't do this," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "Please, listen to me. If you go after them, they'll hurt you." Let me. Her words caught in her throat as she saw the creature begin to rise, its massive frame trembling but resolute. Sparks trailed from its exposed circuits, and its quantum core pulsed with uneven light, but it stood tall, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the crater whole. Umbra Nexus let out a roar, a guttural, primal sound that shook the ground beneath her feet. The air vibrated with its fury, and for a moment, even the gunship seemed to hesitate, its missile launcher pausing mid-turn. Mira's stomach twisted as she realized what it was doing. The Nexus wasn't just preparing to fight, it was preparing to end this, once and for all. "No," she said again, louder this time, grabbing at its armor with both hands. "Don't you dare? You're not just a weapon. You don't have to prove anything to them." The Nexus stilled for a fraction of a second, its massive head turning to meet her gaze. There was something in its expression, a flicker of recognition, of doubt, but then its eyes hardened, and it stepped forward, its claws digging into the dirt as it began to charge. "Umbra!" Mira screamed, stumbling to her feet and chasing after it. The gunship's missile launcher roared to life, and she saw the telltale flare of ignition as the first missile launched. Streaking toward them, her body moved on instinct, her legs propelling her forward even as every rational part of her mind screamed for her to stop. The missile arced through the air, and Mira knew there was no time to think, no time to plan. She threw herself forward, slamming her hand onto the stabilizer embedded in Umbra Nexus's side. "Override!" she shouted, her voice cracking as she issued the command. The stabilizer whirred to life, sending a pulse through the creature's systems that forced its core into a temporary shutdown. The Nexus stumbled mid-charge, its massive body collapsing to the ground just as the missile exploded above them. The shockwave hit like a tidal wave, throwing Mira off her feet and slamming her into the dirt. She coughed, her ears ringing, as debris rained down around her. When the smoke began to clear, she forced herself upright, her vision swimming. Umbra Nexus lay motionless a few feet away, its massive frame half buried in rubble. "No," she whispered, crawling toward it on hands and knees. Her fingers clawed at the dirt as she reached its side, her heart sinking at the sight of its darkened core. Come on, you can't quit now." Her hands fumbled for the stabilizer, but the device was sparking. She cursed under her breath, panic clawing at her throat as she tried to assess the damage. The core wasn't completely offline, but it was barely flickering, its pulse faint and uneven. "Mira," Cade's voice crackled through her calm, his tone frantic. "Are you still alive? What the hell just happened?" "They fired a missile," she said, her voice shaking. "Umbra took the hit. I shut it down before it could engage, but it's not going to hold. Cade, I need you to do something for me. Please don't say something stupid," he muttered. She ignored him, her fingers working desperately to rewire the stabilizer. "I need you to override the gunship's failsafe." "Do you have any idea how difficult that is?" he shot back. "Then you'd better make it count," she snapped, her voice tight with frustration. "Because if you don't, there won't be anyone left to arrest you." Cade muttered a string of curses, followed by the faint sound of frantic typing. Mira didn't wait to hear his reply. She turned her attention back to Umbra Nexus, her hands trembling as she worked to stabilize its systems. "Come on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're stronger than this. I know you are." The creature's eyes flickered faintly, a dim red glow that barely pierced the smoke. It rumbled weakly, a sound that sent a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. She placed a hand on its side, her fingers brushing against its scorched armor. "You're not just a weapon," she said softly. "You're more than that. You proved it." The glow in its core pulsed once, faint but steady, and Mira's breath caught. She leaned closer, her voice trembling. "That's it. Stay with me, just a little longer." Above them, the gunships began to falter, their systems flickering as Cade's hack took effect. The missiles still mounted on their launchers began to smoke, the warheads glowing ominously as their failsafe engaged. Mira barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the faint rhythm of Umbra Nexus's core, the fragile pulse of light that refused to fade. When the first gunship exploded in midair, the shockwave rattled the ground, but Mira didn't flinch. Her hand stayed on the Nexus's side, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to the creature. "You're going to be okay." And for the first time, she believed it. The battlefield was quiet now, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of scorched metal. The gunships were gone, their wreckage scattered across the horizon like distant scars against the landscape. Mira sat slumped beside Umbra Nexus, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Her hand rested on the creature's side, where its core's faint glow had steadied into a rhythmic pulse, soft but alive. "You did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers brushed against the battered armor, tracing the scorch marks left by the missile's blast. You survived. The Nexus stirred beneath her touch, its massive head lifting just enough to meet her gaze. The glowing red of its eyes was no longer menacing. There was something quieter there now, something almost understanding. It rumbled low in its throat, a sound that resonated more like gratitude than fury. Mira's chest tightened, and she blinked back tears. For a moment, she couldn't find the words. The weight of everything, the danger, the destruction, the impossible odds, pressed down on her. But so did the overwhelming realization that they had made it through. Against all logic, against every expectation, they had survived. Together. The comm crackled to life in her ear. Mira, Cade's voice came through, rough and strained but unmistakably alive. Are you okay? She let out a shaky laugh, her eyes still locked on Umbra Nexus. Yeah, I think so. What about you? Still breathing, he muttered. For now, though I'm pretty sure I just broke about 17 galactic laws shutting down those gunships. I'll bake you a cake in prison, she said, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Thanks, Cade, I mean it. Don't thank me yet, he said, his voice softening. You've still got a giant murder machine to deal with. Mira glanced at the Nexus, its head now resting on the ground as if the weight of its own body was finally catching up to it. It wasn't a murder machine anymore, she thought. Not to her. He's not what you think he is, she murmured, her fingers still resting on its armor. Cade's sigh crackled through the calm. Whatever you say, Mira, but if it decides to vaporize us all tomorrow, I'm keeping the I told you so rights. She let the calm fall silent, her focus returning fully to the Nexus. Its breathing was slow but steady, its massive frame rising and falling with each labored inhale. The stabilizer had done its job for now, but the damage was extensive. It needed more than a field repair, it needed a chance to heal, to rebuild, and Mira was determined to give it that chance. You saved me, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. You didn't have to, but you did, and now I'm going to save you, too. The Nexus didn't respond, but its eyes closed slowly, the tension in its massive body easing as it finally allowed itself to rest. Mira felt her own body relax in response, the adrenaline that had kept her moving finally fading. She leaned back against the creature's side, her head resting against its armor as she stared up at the smoke-filled sky. In the distance, the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the haze, painting the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. It was a new day, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Mira allowed herself to believe that it could also be a new beginning. The sound of boots crunching against the dirt pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Cade approaching, his face streaked with dirt and sweat but alive with relief. He crouched beside her, his sharp gaze flicking between her and the Nexus. I can't believe you pulled that off, he said, shaking his head. It's not a thing, she said quietly, her tone firm but not unkind. It's Umbra, and he's more than what they made him to be. Cade raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, he let out a tired sigh and sat down beside her, his back against the Nexus's massive frame. You've got a habit of proving people wrong. You know that? Mira smiled faintly, her eyes still on the horizon. Somebody has to. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of what they just endured settling over them like a heavy blanket. The Nexus's breathing remained steady, its massive form radiating a faint warmth that was almost comforting. Mira felt a strange sense of peace, as though the chaos of the last few hours had finally begun to give way to something calmer, something brighter. What happens now? Cade asked, breaking the silence. Mira didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the Nexus, her hand still resting on its side. The faint hum of its core was steady beneath her fingers, a quiet reminder of the life that still burned within it. Finally, she turned to Cade, her expression resolute. Now we help him, she said. We give him a chance to be something more than what they made him, and maybe we show the rest of the galaxy that they can be more, too. Cade gave her a skeptical look but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned his head back against the Nexus and let out a dry chuckle. You've got your work cut out for you. Mira smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of exhaustion and hope. I wouldn't have it any other way. As the sun rose higher, cutting through the last of the smoke, the three of them remained there, human, machine, and something in between. It wasn't a perfect ending. The scars of the battle still lingered, and the road ahead would be anything but easy, but it was a beginning, and for Mira, that was enough.